development, the drug is active against the disease, and it's going to help patients. It's probably indicated, or if you use it early in the course of disease, it's probably more effective, particularly for patients who are at higher risk of an adverse outcome, and I think that's how it's likely to be used. One of the interesting things about the emergency use authorization that was granted today is that the FDA is allowing the drug to be dosed for 5 days instead of 10. So it was studied in the trial in 10 days, but they're allowing it to be used for 5 days. So that's going to allow Gilead to effectively double the supply. The only place that the EUA, the emergency use authorization, requires a full 10-day course is for intubated patients, so patients who have already been put on a ventilator. Right now, the EUA also specifies that the drug's indicated for patients who have symptoms of COVID that causes them to either have low oxygen in their blood or require supplemental O2, supplemental oxygen. So it can be used in moderate patients as well as severe patients. And so I think this is a pretty broad indication, a pretty broad authorization, and it gives maximal flexibility to physicians. So it's a very good development.
It is a good development, Doctor, and there have been a number of them lately when it comes to other treatments potentially and some clinical trials that we've been keeping an eye on, vaccine momentum, testing momentum, and the numbers continue to improve in this country for hospitalizations, deaths, ICU visits. What's your level of optimism, would you say, heading out at the end of this week versus where you were a few weeks ago?
Well, I think we actually need to be very cautious what we're seeing nationally. If you look at the national trends without the New York data, so you exclude New York, what we're actually seeing is cases growing, and we're seeing hospitalizations increase. And I just put out on Twitter the data on hospitalizations. Hospitalizations are actually going up. So I think we're seeing an expanding epidemic around many parts of this country. At very best, we're seeing the epidemic plateau, and it's going to be some time before we see sustained declines in new cases, at least another week or two till we start to see those declines. There's 25 states in the country that we're actually seeing new cases each day. So the case counts are growing each day. So I think this is a real challenge, and it's an indication that the mitigation probably isn't working as well as we hoped it would. We're not seeing the kinds of sharp declines that we would have hoped. Once you exclude California, the Pacific Northwest, and the New York tri-state region, it's a very mixed bag what you're seeing nationally.
Dr. Gottlieb, clearly some good news this week on treatments in Gilead and REMDESIVIR in particular. I wanted to ask your latest thoughts on possible vaccines, and in particular the news out of the University of Oxford this week under Professor Sir John Bell, where he spoke of potentially having a vaccine that could be ready for a large portion of the UK population by September, which seems a lot faster than a lot of the conversation we've had over here. What do you make of that?
Well, look, I think the technology story is very encouraging, and I think there's a risk that even with the mitigation steps that we took, we get persistent infection. We never really get below 20, maybe 30,000 cases a day all through the summer, and we never really get rid of this. But coming back in the fall, I think we're going to have a much better toolbox. We'll have very robust screening in place, so we'll be able to detect virus more easily. We're going to have remdesivir available. We'll hopefully have one or more antibody-based drugs, which should also be effective. And I think we're going to have vaccines in sufficient doses that we can deploy them in the setting of outbreaks, still experimentally, so they'll be under protocols. We'll be conducting large-scale trials, but we'll be able to use them in cities where there's outbreaks to try to ring-fence the outbreak and use them both for therapeutic purposes as well as continuing to study them. The Oxford vaccine looks promising. They partnered with AstraZeneca, which has the heft to actually manufacture that at scale. But there's now a number of large biopharmaceutical companies in the vaccine race with promising-looking products. Pfizer, the company that I work with, Merck is in this, J&J, Sanofi, as well as a handful of smaller biotech companies that have partnered with big partners like Moderna, which partnered with Lonza today, which has the capacity to produce a vaccine at scale. So we could be coming back in the fall and have vaccines from multiple manufacturers available in certainly the millions of doses, and maybe even when you put it all together, the tens of millions of doses.
Dr. Gottlieb, clearly good news on remdesivir, just back to the treatment side of things. It's an IV drug, though, and it's used on people that are hospitalized. Where are we on getting a pill that every day people can use, prophylactically, really early on to prevent even having to go to a hospital?
Right. I think we're a long way from that. So this is a first-generation antiviral. I think it's going to take a second or third-generation antiviral before we can formulate something into a pill, kind of like Tamiflu. Even the antibody-based drugs are going to be an infusion. The good news about the antibody-based drugs, and I do think that one or more of these can be successful and we can have it available by the fall, is that you can use it prophylactically as a bridge to a vaccine. So what it would most likely be is a monthly injection that prevents you from getting the infection. So you would deploy it in people like frontline healthcare workers, people who are at high risk of having a bad outcome, maybe people in nursing homes or people who are immunocompromised. So, if we get all these technologies on the market, even if we don't get rid of this virus, we do have persistent spread. And I think there's a real risk that we're going to have persistent infection, and the mitigation is going to slow the rate of spread, but not get rid of the infection altogether. But even with persistent infection, if we have the right technology, we can reduce the risk of COVID. We can, support our hospitals, get our healthcare system in the proper place to deal with this, and use these technologies, these drugs, to actually reduce death and mitigate the disease and make it a less severe disease in a greater number of patients. That's the hope. That's the hope what this will deliver.
Dr. Gottlieb, we've seen clashes or the tone of the confrontation with China elevate again over the last couple of days. Do you think it's pretty much now decided that manufacturing of drugs for U.S. citizens long-term will shift meaningfully back to the U.S. away from China?
I think we're going to look at public health issues much differently in the future, and they're going to be strategic issues. We're going to look at public health through the lens of strategic security, and we're going to want to make sure we have manufacturing capacity here in the U.S. for things that are critical. Certainly the vaccines that are being developed and the antibody-based drugs, we're looking to have domestic manufacturing capacity for those products, recognizing that if we're dependent upon foreign manufacturing capacity, countries may not let go of the supply. In 2009, with H1N1 virus, with the influenza, the pandemic influenza, we had vaccine that was being manufactured in a foreign country for the United States. It was under contract by the United States, and that country didn't allow the supply to be shipped back to the United States until they satisfied their local needs. So in a pandemic situation, when countries are facing a public health crisis, they're going to take care of their citizens. And so we have to depend on domestic manufacturing for these kinds of products.
Yeah, and also to your point of why we need to win the vaccine race. Dr. Gottlieb, one more question. I was looking at the mortality rates, and that is the deaths per capita, because I think this gets right to the heart of the reopening debate, with states all going in different directions. If you look at states like Ohio and California, which, by all accounts, according to the doctors, did it right. They closed down early. They were very cautious. Those numbers, 9 in Ohio, 5 in California, versus states like Texas and Florida, which waited late, kept places open, like the beaches, actually have lower death rates at 3 for Texas and 6 for Florida. So how do you explain that?
There is variability in the death rates from different parts of the country, and it's hard to explain because there shouldn't be variability in the healthcare system. I mean, there probably is some undetected deaths going on. We're probably not capturing all the deaths. And it is the case in places where you had real significant hotspots, you saw the death rates start to go up, and that probably was a sign that the healthcare systems were getting pressed. You look at states like Ohio, they see a sustained reduction in new cases. Louisiana's seeing that. South Dakota's seeing that. Idaho's seeing it. So there are parts of the country, there's about 7 states where you do see sustained reductions in new cases. So there are parts of the country that certainly look good. The Pacific Northwest, like I said, in the tri-state area. But when you look outside those regions and those states, it's a really mixed bag. And overall, the trends are in the direction of expanding cases and expanding hospitalizations once you take out New York City from those totals.